Welcome to AI Goes to College, the podcast that helps higher education professionals navigate the changes brought on by generative AI. I'm Dr. Craig Van Slyke, and I host the podcast along with friend, colleague, and co-host Dr. Robert E. Crossler. Combined, Rob and I have over 40 years of experience in higher education, serving in roles ranging from adjunct faculty to dean. We're here to help you figure out what in the world's going on with generative AI and, more importantly, what you can do about it. Welcome to another episode of AI Goes to College, and once again I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Robert E. Crossler of Washington State University. Rob, how is Europe?
Europe's great, Craig. It's a slower pace of life, which has been kind of nice. So I've enjoyed the time to enjoy that, reflect on things. I find myself having more time to think about things, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, that could go either way. All right. Well, I'm glad you're having a good time over there. Well, let's get to it. So it's been kind of a big week or week and a half for generative AI, and it seems like a lot of them are really big. But there were two huge developments in the last week or so, one of which was finally a new model from Anthropic, Claude Sonnet 3.7. There's a whole thing about why they jumped from 3.5 to 3.7, so it's weird. There never was a real 3.6, so this is the next model after 3.5. It caused a lot of excitement. I'm a big Claude fan generally. What it's good at, it's really good at. Have you had a chance to try it yet?
Yeah, I played with it a little bit. I've been reading a lot about how it will just do programming for you, and you plug that stuff in. And before this call, I went on and had it make the Minesweeper game for me, and it worked incredibly well, and I had a game in 30 seconds. I mean, it was wonderful. And that wasn't really taking advantage of 3.7, but seeing some of the stuff that I've read about with what it's doing with its agents, bringing everything together into one place, it's going to be an interesting space to really push what they're doing.
Yeah, you and I are both in IS, information systems, and so we really need to think about this a lot because I don't know what's going to happen with coding. We've talked about that a little bit and what do we need to shift to, but even if you're in some other discipline, I think it's worth paying attention to what's going on with coding and Claude Sonnet 3.7 because other professions are going to follow. It's not that big of a stretch to tie this into accounting, math, tutoring. I mean, you can just go down the list, and I think you're going to see one thing after another get ticked off where before now it's been nice as an aid to programming, but everything I've seen online is like, yeah, it can really help make a good programmer more efficient, and you can maybe do some little stuff if you're a novice, but it's not going to turn somebody that knows nothing into a real developer. Claude with 3.7 sounds like it may be a little bit different. Is that what you're reading?
I think it's going to help move the bar further. But from what I've seen, it still struggles with the complicated nature of big, large, hairy problems and being able to figure out where the bugs are and to integrate those sorts of things. And that's where I think the human expertise is still really going to be necessary because a lot of our code, at least existing code, is probably not the most cleanly written code. It's most easiest to understand. And I think that the human developer that can understand that and then lean into these tools still becomes way more efficient. Where I see the struggle is how is this going to affect the entry-level programmer and the development of that entry-level programmer to a point where they can be that intermediate-level programmer that's needed for where these tools aren't quite capable yet. And then the better and better tools like Claude gets, I think, creates a huge challenge for the development of people at the beginning of their careers.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's going to change the nature of those entry-level jobs in a big way. I'm a little worried that in the short run, it may take away a lot of entry-level jobs, but that creates a whole lot of downstream problems for employers. So, we need to have some big conversations about that. I have some ideas, and maybe that's something we should talk about on a future episode. So, how did your Minesweeper game turn out? Is it like the old school Minesweeper?
It reminded me of 1995 and my Windows 3.1 device. So it worked well, and it had some nice flashbacks to my teenage years when I was first learning how to use a mouse and how to use Windows. And to be able to create it that fast was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I just don't know where this is all going to go, and I don't know that anybody else does either. But I do think that anybody who is in higher ed needs to be thinking more and more about what it's going to mean for the talent pipeline into organizations. And maybe more importantly, organizations need to be thinking about that. I had a pretty interesting conversation with some people from the Society for Information Management. And SIM is a big group of thousands of CIOs, chief information officers, and other high-level IT people. And this was their Work 4.0 special interest group. And we had a pretty interesting conversation about entry-level jobs and the talent gap, the skills gap that may pop up if we cut off these entry-level jobs. Because then how do you develop the mid-level people? If you shut off the entry point into the pipeline's cut off. You're not going to get people further in. So, I don't know, big questions. I wish I had more answers because we'd be making a lot of money on the consulting circuit, but...
So, Craig, I want to speak to that just a little bit because I've read counter arguments to this. And that is that a lot of organizations are yet to see profit from investment in these AI technologies. And so we do, on one hand, hear that it's going to cost us these entry-level jobs and do all of these sorts of things. But much like many technologies before, organizations that don't have a clear plan and a clear way of implementing are not yet seeing profits and are turning away, abandoning some AI adoptions because they aren't seeing the promised delivery of doing these sorts of things. So while I do see the potential for exactly what we're talking about, if not done properly by organizations, I think we're going to see a lot of wasted investments that aren't going to result in the promised payoff of a much more efficient workforce. So I think there's something to be said for properly and appropriately doing this sort of thing with a plan, as opposed to thinking, oh, I just have to adopt AI and it's going to work magically to deliver all of these performance efficiencies.
It's the same thing we've seen over and over again. But is it Amara's law?
We tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run.
Yep. And I think that's going to be true for generative AI. And we're already seeing that. I mean, look at all of the early e-commerce efforts that were spectacular failures. Peapod. Remember Peapod?
Pets.com?
Yeah. But now you have Walmart delivery and all those kinds of services, and you have Chewy.
But I'll go to, it took us 20 years to get there, right? Amazon was
Yeah.
not profitable for how long? We're going to see a lot of these AI companies that look like they're very promising. A year, 2 years from now, they aren't going to be around anymore because they didn't find their way towards profit. But there will be others that will survive, and they'll be like the Amazon that operated in deficit for years and years and years, but then finally became the behemoth that we know Amazon as today. So there's going to be some ups and there's going to be downs and there's going to be pains and there's going to be successes, but it will survive and it will change the way we do things.
And a lot of these early failures will just be a step towards ultimate success. Somebody will sit back and watch whatever the generative AI equivalent of Peapod or Pets.com is, and they'll think, okay, here's where they messed up, or here's the piece of the puzzle they didn't have, and you get, Chewy, or I know the only grocery delivery we can get is Walmart, but I'm sure there are lots of other. DoorDash, that's the one, right?
DoorDash, Uber Eats. I mean, there's all sorts of delivery services now that COVID-19 pandemic really accelerated some of those sorts of things to profitability.
You big city folk have those, us in
we don't have those. Coleman, what are you talking about?
Those of us in Eris, Louisiana don't have those. But Walmart will bring our groceries, and that's a wonderful thing. The other big announcement that kind of flew under the radar a little bit, which surprised me, is I think it was just yesterday, OpenAI released ChatGPT Deep Research to Plus and Teams members. So previously, it was only available to Pro members. I think Plus is $20 a month. Teams is either 25 or 30, depending upon how you pay for it. And Pro is $200 a month. And guess who got a Pro subscription literally 2 days before they released Deep Research to everybody?
They were waiting for you to buy that, Craig, before they decided to release it.
That was the trigger. Said, all right, Van Slyke bought it. Boom, go. Have you used it? Have you played with it?
I have not played with it. I've read a lot about it, and I've got some ideas of things I'm going to do, but I do have some concerns with it, but it's definitely exciting on the surface.
Yeah, my 2 trials were three trials were pretty amazing, although 2 of them had some obvious deficiencies. So I did 3 things. I did kind of a pre-review for a big paper a colleague and I are working on. So this is one of those papers where we've been working on it forever. It's a really good idea. Even a mutual friend of ours who is not easy to impress thought it was a pretty good idea and a good paper. So we've been working on it slowly, and we're in that last push before submission. And normally I would send it to you and send it to some other people and get some comments, but everybody's busy and I hate to impose, and you don't want to have to bug people. So I was a little reluctant to do that. I put it into Deep Research and said, here's the journal we're targeting, here's the paper, here's what I want to accomplish. It came back and asked me a bunch of pretty pointed questions about exactly what I wanted. And then it gave me, I think it was a 16-page review of the article. I don't write 16-page reviews. And I write really detailed reviews, but mine are not 16 pages. I haven't gone through it in great detail yet, but everything that I saw on a scan was either something that I would have anticipated. You and I both do a lot of reviewing and editorial work, and so you kind of know where the problems are going to be. But it pointed out a lot of things that I hadn't quite thought of yet. And so that second set of eyes, it may push us from a rejection to a revise and resubmit. Maybe not. We'll find out. But it's going to be a better paper because of it. And this whole thing took, now not reading through it in detail, but producing that 16-page developmental review took 15 or 20 minutes. How long do you spend on a review for a top journal?
Sometimes the full day.
Yeah, at least. It ain't 15 minutes, I can tell you that. But I think this has huge, huge implications for academic research.
And what I would love to do, Craig, and maybe this is something we can do in the future, is talk to an editor of one of our top journals, because I've been spending some time gathering the AI policies of various different journals from the Academy of Management, from Journal of Business Venturing, and other places that our faculty in my department publish.
And they are all over the board.
They're all over the board, but many of them limit your use of AI technologies to either grammatical and spelling type errors, and if you're going to use it as some sort of data analysis, you need to discuss that in your research methods as one of the research analysis tools. And so as you talk about creative uses like this that are becoming available through the advancing of these technologies, I wonder how this sits with the gatekeepers, and how are people even going to acknowledge that they do it, which has some ethical implications of its own. Is it a better use of reviewer resources to expect that people use these tools to review it and begin addressing things from a perspective such as this? I don't know the answers, but it would be great to talk to one of the editors-in-chiefs of these journals to see what their views are on the use of technologies like this.
That'd make an interesting panel discussion. Maybe we can put that together.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
I'm not even sure I know what the ethics of disclosure are there. I didn't use generative AI to write anything, to create anything. It's just giving feedback. How is that different from me sending it to you? Now, if I said, okay, here, develop a research question or something like that, maybe I'm starting to cross some lines. But the one that gets me, so my doctoral students are turning in their seminar papers this weekend. And day before yesterday when we were meeting, I told them, for the love of all that's holy, run your paper through Grammarly. Because I don't want to read bad writing. And they're all actually pretty good writers, despite the fact that a couple of them are not native English speakers. But why would we not want people to use tools like that? I was looking, I can't remember what journal it was, but just the other day, they had very detailed policies that were pretty restrictive around generative AI. But they specifically said you should run this through a copy editing AI tool. It wasn't just, it's okay to do this, it's you should do this. And, we've talked about that before. But deep research changes things a lot.
Yes.
And Gemini's had deep research. It's been actually pretty solid. But the other test that I did is I asked for some deep research on generative AI and critical thinking. So my pro account produced a 34-page report. I'll bet I could go in, edit it a little bit, and sell it as a white paper. It was good enough for that. I tried it again on Plus, and it produced a 20-page report, which doesn't mean it was worse. Maybe it's better because it's more concise. And there were some flaws due to my lack of skill at this. Like the one I sent you, you pointed out that it kept citing the same 3 sources over and over again. And that's partially my fault for not giving it some example sources and doing some other things that would have improved the result. But, I just don't know where this leads us in terms of higher ed. I mean, the research report in its old form may be dead.
Well, here's where I think that there's an interesting challenge in the midst of this. And you alluded it to in what you said and how you've looked over this, the feedback I gave you, is to know that what you got is reliable and good requires a level of expertise to be able to look at that and to know that it's reliable and good. And so I think in some ways the burden of what is education changes to how do we help our students to know how to know that what they've created is reliable and good. Because from what I'm seeing is sometimes the deep research turns out amazing things that are really good, and other times it has some pretty phenomenal flaws in it. But it is written really, really good that if you're not that level of expert, if you don't have a level of expertise, you may not pick up on those flaws that are baked into it. And so I think the nature of what it is we need to be looking for and ensuring in that critical thinking component is almost next level of what we expect from students today. And so therein lies the challenge, is how do we get to that next level of critical thinking as these are being evaluated from where people's abilities are in current state.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I cannot disagree with anything you've said there. Although it's a funny thing. So this has tremendous potential for bringing somebody up to speed really quickly in an area. As long as you don't rely on it to be absolutely 100% true and totally comprehensive, I don't see much harm in that. It's kind of a jump starter. But then on the other end, you've got people that have that deep expertise. I've got a great little story about Perplexity's deep research, which I'm a big Perplexity fan, although it's stumbled a little bit lately. So I ask it about this thing in security. Here's something we're working on. I want to find out about these adjacent areas. And it cited a paper by one of our mutual friends, Karen Renault, out of Strathclyde in Scotland. And Karen is a just insanely prolific publisher. But first I thought, well, I kind of know what she does, and I don't remember seeing this. But she publishes a lot of stuff, so maybe I just didn't see it. So I went into Google Scholar and looked through her Google Scholar, which was quite humbling to look at her Google Scholar versus mine, but I couldn't find it. Perplexity gave me a link, but a link to a completely different paper on a completely different topic. I mean, nothing to do with this was a cybersecurity topic. It was, like, I don't know what it was about, but it was just nothing to do with it. So finally, I emailed her, said, "Hey, Karen, I found this thing that's attributed to you. The thing didn't exist." She sent me a paper that was very slightly related to this topic. So you could maybe start to see how the hallucination got put together. But it was 100% totally made up. And if I hadn't been up enough on the security literature and had the skills to go in and check everything, I could have looked like a bigger idiot than I normally look like. So,
Yeah, and that's where I think some of the challenge is. Because if I think about a 35-page document, let's assume that something like that was on page 25. And I'm going through the first 20 pages with a critical eye, and it's looking really, really good to me. At what point do I feel confident that everything else is going to be good as well? And so when you're not creating it yourself and putting your own thought into each and every section, at what point do we get in a hurry, if you will, or if our cognitive abilities start to wear out? Do we put the rubber stamp onto things that ultimately turn out to be fabricated? How do we ensure we don't do that, right? And I think it's a check we have to put on ourselves to make sure that we don't say, okay, good enough, but we truly say, yes, if I would have written this, this is basically, what I would have come up with.
yeah, it's the old human in the loop idea that we keep talking about. People are going to take these deep research reports, put their names on them, and put them out into the world. And they're running some huge risks if they do that. But for academics and for really anybody in higher ed, I can see the potential of having this as kind of background. And then anything important, I'm going to try to dig into a little bit more. So on a 34-page report, I would probably use zero of it in terms of putting it into my own document. But in terms of, okay, this is a decent way to organize it. Here's maybe a perspective I hadn't thought about. Here's some links I can go check real quickly. If it saves me 5 or 10 hours, which is not an unreasonable estimate, it's the same thing when we have research assistants. We don't take what they do and publish it.
But here's where I think we might have some generational differences, Craig. I wonder if our 20-year-old students would take that same approach, or if they would say, "Oh, I created something for me. It's good. I'm turning it in." What is it about your life experiences and your training and those sorts of things that have gotten you to the point where you're maybe a little bit more skeptical and wanting to ensure that it truly communicates what you want, as opposed to, yeah, if it gets me at least a B, life is good. Let's move on to the other thing I'd rather be doing.
6 decades of mistakes what got me here. But that's our job as educators.
That's the conversation we should be having, is what does education look like to where we know these tools are available, but yet we want our students to be critical, be skeptical, and to use the tools, but also at the end of the day, have a level of confidence in what they put forward, that it is accurate and correct and consistent with what they want to be saying.
And this is the big message that I think we want to get out there. Educators need to figure out the capabilities of these tools like deep research so we can help guide students to use them appropriately. We don't know how they work, what they're good at, what they're bad at, how to use them effectively. Then it's going to be really hard for us to teach our students how to do it. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. And I think the place where I'd push that even a little bit further is, in the past, I've seen solutions that were, I'm going to pick on Microsoft Excel, of let's create a Microsoft Excel class and then assume the students know how to use Microsoft Excel, and then it can show up everywhere else and they'll know how to use it. And then people complain, students don't know how to use Microsoft Excel because, oh, it's been 2 years since they've done it. You just assumed that they'd remember. I think a lot of what we're talking about needs to be context specific to the material that people are covering. And it's something that gets beat into people's heads over and over and over again, and not just, well, as freshmen, we taught them how to use it in their intro class. Therefore, everything else should be good. It's repeated learning because so much changes, and it's going to be so different depending on the context in which you're using it.
Yeah, we need coordination. Yes, Excel across the curriculum. There's AI now across the curriculum, ethics across the curriculum. All right. Well, that takes us into another topic. Do you have anything else to say on deep research?
I would probably talk forever about deep research, but I think this is a good pivot point.
I do want to give one big caution, because this was not highly publicized, but if you're a Plus or a Teams user, you get 10 deep research queries a month. So use them wisely.
I think it's because they want you to spend $200 once you feel that you can use it meaningfully and want to use it more.
Yes, I'm going to use I get 100 with Pro. Amazing how that works out, right? 10 times more, 10 times more. Pro also does have access to a different reasoning model that's much stronger than the O3 Mini that the others have. It's not worth $200 a month for most people. I want to be really clear about that. Okay, so we've kind of talked around the edges of a really important topic in terms of generative AI, and that's critical thinking. And there's a lot of talk about generative AI and critical thinking, and is it the end of critical thinking? Is it going to degrade critical thinking? There was a paper that came out fairly recently. It basically found that people felt like they did not give the same level of effort in their critical thinking when they use generative AI. The paper is Lee et al. 2025. It's some people from Microsoft, a bunch of people from Microsoft, and one person, Lee, from Carnegie Mellon. So some fairly big-time folks. What they did is they did a study where they asked people how they use generative AI and then basically asked them whether or not they thought they put more or less cognitive effort into it. And I'm way oversimplifying the paper. And people reported that they put in less cognitive effort into critical thinking when they use generative AI, which in my mind proves not very much. Part of the point is to put less cognitive effort into critical thinking. I mean, that's part of what I want to use it for. I know I'm kind of going at this in a pretty roundabout way, but the bottom line is generative AI can degrade critical thinking skills or it can enhance them. It's all about how it's used. And as educators, how we teach students to use generative AI. And I think that lines up with a lot of what you've been saying, Rob. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would. And here's where I was thinking about this last night. I almost wonder when it comes to the creation of documents, information, whatever you want to do with generative AI, is there a scale from 0 where it's means nothing in what's created to 100 where it's super important, to where then I can look at something and say, if it's towards 0, it doesn't really matter, then I can just take it for what it is, and use it however without much critical thought towards what it creates, versus 100, right? It's going to be world changing, life changing, career changing, one of those sorts of documents that I really need to put on that critical thinking hat and look through it very, very intentionally. And kind of that first step of the process and what I'm creating is asking, how important is the outcome of the creation of this material? And if it's pretty important, then to say I'm going to take that cognitive effort I saved in writing it and I'm going to invest that into evaluating. Versus, I wrote a funny poem that's going to make me and my friends laugh. Well, maybe that doesn't require much cognitive effort in looking at that and seeing what that does.
And the cynic in me thinks back on all the reports that I put together over my career that I'm sure literally nobody has ever read. That's not a knock on universities. Any large organization has that same kind of thing going on. So yeah, there's that piece of it. But that's part of critical thinking, is how much effort should I put into whatever it is that I'm trying to create or analyze. I want us to send a couple of messages. One is AI is a neutral tool, like a lot of technologies. So if it's used poorly, it's going to degrade critical thinking. If it's used well, it's going to enhance critical thinking skills. But we've got to help push students into that enhance. And I want to give you just a few ways that we might do this. One is AI is a great devil's advocate. You can tell it, I want you to literally act as the devil's advocate. And the devil's advocate was the one in the Catholic Church who would argue against whatever position was being promoted. AI would be great at that.
Well, and here's where I've seen that useful too, Craig, and this is where the existence of multiple AI tools is handy. Is I've seen some people that will create documents and use in the creation process, say ChatGPT, and then turn over to Claude and ask Claude to be the devil's advocate. So that way they're getting some of that different reasoning, some of the different training, the different approaches, criticizing what they've been doing. And that way it's not a sole reliance on whatever bias might be involved in one of the tools, but it brings together multiple tools to help do some of those sorts of things.
That's a great idea. Although I'm picturing in my mind, telling Claude that here's something ChatGPT produced and then having Claude talk smack.
Well, so, Poe sent an email to me. I woke up to it this morning. I haven't played with it yet, but they've got a tool now that is, I think they call it the Poe agent, that will let you bounce between multiple different things with the same content and share it across the various different GPTs in a way that is seamless.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I actually did this with a little experiment with Grok. Have you tried Grok? Mm-hmm. Grok's pretty good.
No, my one concern with Grok, and this is a little bit of a tangent, is if it's trained straight up on Twitter data, which I think to some level it is, there's some things on Twitter that I'm not sure that I want influencing the conversations I'm having, because they've taken some of the guardrails off that I get why they do it, but at the same time, I'm not sure that's what I want in one of these tools.
No, my conclusion was, as much as I liked Grok, it wasn't better enough for me to want to switch. I did the same prompt through Claude, ChatGPT, and Grok, and their best models, and then actually had ChatGPT evaluate the three. And it said that Grok's output was the best. It wasn't a big margin. There were differences. Grok struck a better balance between comprehensiveness and conciseness, but a different prompt might have come out differently. And it was not anything that the Twitter nonsense could have really bled into.
Yeah, but I read that, and I find it interesting that it picked a winner amongst all of those. It's almost like it was forced to pick a winner, because they all...
It was forced. I told it, you have to pick a winner.
Yeah, because I could see it coming out in any of the different ways. So.
Yeah, they were all good. I mean, they were all very solid. You're absolutely right. I did force it to pick a winner and to explain its reasoning, which it did. So another critical thinking idea is uncovering hidden assumptions. So you've written something. There are always layers of assumptions under pretty much anything you do. And they're really hard to see because we hold some of our assumptions so deeply that we're just not aware of them at all. But that's a huge aspect of critical thinking. If you get to where you can identify your own assumptions or the assumptions that are underlying somebody else's arguments, you're going to be a much better critical thinker because of that one thing. And AI can do that repeatedly to where you get to the point where you can identify them on your own more effectively.
Yeah, and that's an interesting challenge. I've asked students even to identify what their own bias is that they're bringing into the prompting that they're doing and some of those sorts of things. And just asking them what bias they're bringing in almost blows their mind that they have to consider that. So I can imagine how, as you then take that to the next level and say what bias or what assumptions are in the model and in the results because of that. And then the next step further is, how do we then change prompting? How do we change how we approach these sorts of things to try to eliminate bias? Because I don't think you can ever perfectly eliminate all bias, that there is always some level of bias present in everything. It's just, are we comfortable with what that bias is, and are we aware of it?
Absolutely. And this is kind of a bigger point about generative AI and higher ed is, look, you or I could play devil's advocate, or we could help students identify implicit assumptions probably better than AI can. We've both done this kind of thing for a long time. That's a big part of our professions. But how much time do you have to spend on that? But ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, it's just there. It'll work with you until you run out of quota. But that's where I think we need to change our mindset a little bit, away from, is this as good, AI stuff as good as what a professor can be, to, is it available enough and good enough to make a difference in the education of our students? That seems like a good place to end. What do you think?
Works for me.
This has been another episode of AI Goes to College, the podcast that helps higher ed professionals navigate the changing world of generative AI. We'll talk to you next time. Bye. Thanks for listening to AI Goes to College. If you found this episode useful, you'll love the AI Goes to College newsletter. Each edition brings you useful tips, news, and insights that you can use to help you figure out what in the world is going on with generative AI and how it's affecting higher ed. Just go to aigoestocollege.com to sign up. I won't try to sell you anything, and I won't spam you or share your information with anybody else. As an incentive for subscribing, I'll send you the Getting Started with Generative AI guide. Even if you're an expert with AI, you'll find the guide useful for helping your less knowledgeable colleagues.